Hi everyone, and welcome back to the Alluring Bead Boutique Design channel. My name is Trina, and today I'm going to be moving on to part 2 of our earring tutorial. For this portion of the tutorial, we have already created in the first part our little beaded bezel for our little 8mm ornate chaton using our Delicas and our 15-0s. In this section, we are going to be creating the initial part of our brick stitch around this bead frame. And once again, this is a 25mm soldered closed antique brass hoop, and I'll continue on to be using the olive green Nymo thread. And for the beads we'll need for this portion are our 8/0 seed beads, our 11/0 Delicas, and our 15/0s. And you can see the description box below for the full materials list, or you can refer back to the first video. Now, for this section, I'm also going to use Nymo. A couple of tips when using these nylon beading threads. I don't like to ever use more than one wingspan at a time, which is, my arms spread out wide, fingertip to fingertip. And because I'm left-handed, when I take this thread off the spool and I cut it here, this is the end that I will use to thread through my needle. And I learned this tip from a Nancy Kane class I have on Craftsy. And because it has a natural twist, if you're left-handed, you'll want to put the thread through from the cut end off of the spool. You can stretch your thread out just a little bit by holding on to it, taking your fingers and running down the length of it. And then we're also going to use some microcrystalline wax here to wax our thread. I'm going to start at this end just with a really short piece and just pull it through a couple of times like that. And I talked about, in the first video, I talked about, this the wax and all that kind of stuff. And then I'm going to take it to the other side, and I'm just going to hold it with my finger gently. I'm not going to pull super tight. And I'm going to pull the rest of this thread across the top of my wax, just like that. And then I'm going to thread my needle, like I said, with the end that I cut off of the spool. Now, I'm not going to make you guys watch me try to struggle with threading this needle. So once I get it threaded, I'll come back and we will move forward. If the end is still a little bit frayed, you can cut that little tiny tip off right there, and hopefully that will help you pass it through the eye of your needle a little bit better. You can pinch it flat, because it will have to be flat to go through the eye, but the wax does help you to thread it. And just by flattening it with my fingers with the conditioning wax on there, it passed through super easy once I cut those little frayed ends off. So now I have my needle on this end. I'm going to take this end and we're going to just tie it onto our little frame. I'm going to pass it right through just like that, and then I'm just going to tie 2 overhand knots and leave a really short tail. Just like that. Once, twice, get it nice and tight, and then we're ready to begin. I'm going to start off by showing you guys how to do the initial row on the inside, which is all 15/0 seed beads, and then from there we'll move on to the outside edge of our bead frame. But we'll start out with our 15/0s. And on brick stitch, whether you're doing flat brick stitch or any other type of brick stitch, your initial stitch on each row requires that you pick up 2 beads. And this is to prevent you from having exposed thread on your beadwork. So go ahead and pick up 2, and we're going to drop them down. And I'm going to work with my working thread to the back side of this bead frame. So get my beads drop down here just like this. I'm going to take and hold them with my finger where I want them, sitting on the inside edge of that bead frame. Then I'm going to bring my needle around to the front of the bead frame, and because I'm left-handed, I'm going to stitch up through that second bead I picked up, which is this bead on the left. Then I'm going to pull it through, and don't worry if it wiggles out of your hand or anything, because you can just bring it right back into place like that. So now I'm coming out of that top bead here on the left. I'm going to go ahead and I'm going to position my beads to where they are positioned correctly and they're snug together. So I'm going to come back down from top to bottom through that bead on the right. I'm going to pull that through. And now my working thread is on the front here, so I'm just going to pass right back up through the bead on the left. And at the same time, I'm going to put my needle through the frame. Now I have an in-depth video on how to do this particular stitch, and I'll throw a link up for that as well, in case you need a little bit more detail on how to get that to do. But now you can see those two beads are standing up side by side, and that's what we want. And then from there on out, we're just going to be using one bead at a time. And it's a little tedious, but I promise you that you can get through it. You get my two threads here. I've got a little trouble here with these two threads wanting to be stuck together, so I'm just going to pull them apart. I'm going to shorten up that thread just a little bit. Alright, so now I've picked up my next bead, and we're still, remember that we're working from the back side. So I'm going to bring that bead all the way down. Maybe I got a little too much wax on my thread. Alright guys, hold on a second. Sorry about that, I had a little bit of an issue. So now I've picked up my next bead. You can see I'm coming out of the top of this bead on the left. I've picked up my next bead and I'm letting it drop down, and my working thread is back here. I'm going to take my needle and I'm going to come around to the front side of my bead frame, and I'm going to go up through that bead, right, just like that, from bottom to top, and then I'm going to push my needle through the hoop to the back side of the beadwork. Then I'm going to snug these beads in. I'm going to hold on to them with my finger like that as I pull. And now you can see I have my third bead sitting side by side. And folks, that's pretty much all we're going to do all the way around. The trick to it is we want to have an even number of beads. So there's my third bead, and I'm just going to keep on. And I'm going to pick up a bead, drop it down, make it go all the way down. My thread is on the back side of the frame. I'm going to take my needle and I'm going to go up through the end of my working thread is exiting through to the opposite end and go back through the frame at the same time. Just like that. And that's all there is to this. So I'm not going to sit here and make you guys watch me do this whole frame. I'm just going to keep working, and then I'm going to meet you back when I'm getting ready to finish up this row. So I've dropped that bead down. I've come around to the front of the bead frame, and I'm going to pass up through the seed bead, just like that. And stand it up right beside the previous bead. Alright folks, I'm going to keep working, and I'm going to keep a count on the beads, and I'll meet you back. So I'm working along here, and I'm trying to figure out the easiest way to make sure I wind up with an even number of beads. So I have 14 beads on. So what I've done is I've counted out 16 beads, and I've laid them over here. Then I'm going to work until I have those beads added. Then I'm going to pick up another even number of beads and move them over here. And that way I will make sure that I wind up with an even number of beads on the inside edge of my bead frame. Here's another tip for you guys. For one thing I want to talk about is, like, if you'll see why I chose this color of green for my beading thread, because you can barely even see it on this beautiful brass component. If you're finding that your thread is starting to get a little bit loose, your 9mm thread, and you're having trouble keeping your last bead added snugged into position, add a little bit more wax to your thread, and then you can also tighten up the beadwork simply by, I'm coming out of the top of my last bead I added, I'm going to pass down through the bead right before it, making sure to keep my working thread positioned on the right side of my bead frame. And then I'm going to pass back up through that last bead I added one time like that. And basically we're just adding a reinforcing stitch to hold those two beads together just a little bit better. So if you find that you're having a little bit of trouble with that 9mm thread, those are two tips for how to solve the problem. And then just add a little bit of wax to the thread and keep on working. Another tip I want to show you guys, as you're adding these beads on the inside edge or the outside edge, either one, what you're hoping to achieve is to have these beads sitting uniformly side by side without any big gaps in between where you have a huge space in between. And then you also want to make sure that you don't pull them so tight that they're moving off the edge of your bead frame. And you can check that just by simply turning your bead frame just like this. And you can see I don't have any beads poking out on either side of my frame. So I know that my work is really nice. I don't have any gaps in between my beads either. And so those are just some tips on how to help you achieve a really professional look. And I'm going to keep working, and I'll meet you guys back again in a few minutes. So I'm getting pretty close to being done with this row, but I want to talk to you a couple minutes about this particular tail thread here. Because we have a knot right here. There's a couple of ways you can handle this tail thread. You can either apply some super glue to your knot and give it a little bit to dry and then cut the thread off. Or you can take a big eye needle and thread your tail thread onto it. And we're going to weave it away from that knot just a little bit. I don't really care for big eye needles for anything too much other than problem solving and ending threads in this particular situation. So you can see here my knot is over here. I'm actually going to flip that over, and I'm going to come back up through the very first bead right here on my row. And now I'm going to hold that bead while I pull the thread through. And I just pulled it right off the needle. But that's okay because it's an easy fix with these big eye needles. This one's old and a little out of shape, so it's not staying closed very well. Then I'm just going to take this needle and I'm going to come down through that next bead right there. Pull that through. And I'm going to continue weaving that thread up and down through these beads. I'm just going to do a couple of more, and then I'm going to cut the thread off because I'm really having a time with this needle. You can see it's a little gunked up. I need to order some more. So I'm moving up through this fifth bead towards the center of the hoop. I'm going to pull that through, and then I'm just going to go ahead and end my tail thread. I want to end it in the inside edge of this beadwork because I will be stitching another row of beads onto these green beads eventually. So if I have any type of little tiny bit sticking up, I will cover it up later on when I add my Delicas. You can see here that I keep a variety of little types of needles. I have twisted eyes, some big eyes, a couple of different sizes of beading needles, and just some sewing needles and all kinds of stuff in here, just in case you ever need it for anything. It's a good idea to have some needles handy. So I'm going to go ahead and finish getting my beads added here. It looks like I'm going to need I have a total of about 40 beads to cover the inside edge of this hoop. I'll meet you guys back here to add the last couple and show you guys how to stitch and close the beadwork. So I'm getting ready to add my last bead, and as it turns out, I'm wound up adding 42 beads to complete my first row. So I'm picking up that last seed bead, and I'm going to let that drop down into this little gap I have left right here. And I'm going to take my needle and come back up through that bead and poke through the back side of my frame, just like I've been doing. And if I need to, I can spread with my fingers and give that bead just a little bit more room and snug it in there nice and tight so it stands up right beside the previous bead, just like it should. And you can see that my thread is actually acting like it's trying to be a little bit loose. So I'm going to come back down through the previous bead to the right because I'm left-handed. Well, if I can get my eyes to function correctly, I'm going to put that little bead. So I'm going to come back through that previous bead just once. And I'm going to pass back up through that last bead I added just once and go back to the back side again. And that's just going to secure that thread that was trying to come loose and be slippery on me. So now I need to connect this bead to the very first bead. So my thread's here on the back. I'm going to take my needle and I'm going to pass down through the very first bead and come down towards the front of my beadwork, just like that. Then I'm going to take my needle on the front side of the beadwork and I'm going to go back up through the last bead added. Go back to the back of the bead frame and pull. And now I put a thread bridge between the last bead and the first bead at the top and at the bottom. And that's what you call closing the beadwork. So now we are finished with our row 1. Then we finished it up our little row, and we can check to make sure that everything looks really good. If you feel like you have any beads that are poking out, just take your fingers and evenly space your beads out like that. Check your work by turning your frame on the side like this and make sure you don't have anything like seriously poking out and misshapen. And now we're ready to move on. So I'm coming out of the top of that bead right there. I'm just going to take my needle and I'm going to pass down through the next bead to the right or left. It really doesn't matter, because at this point I want to be coming towards the outside edge of my bead frame. And my thread is on this side of the frame, so I'm going to flip that over because I like working with the thread on the back. So the next step we're going to do is we're going to add this row of Delica beads to the outside edge of our bead frame. And we're going to do it exactly like we did the first row. Now I'm just going to dump out a few of my Delicas over here. And once again, for my first stitch of every row, I have to pick up 2 beads. Now I'm going to pick up my 2 Delicas. I'm going to let those drop down to my bead frame just like that. And I'm going to hold them in place with my finger. Now, at this point, we don't have to worry about back and front, because what we're going to do is the reason we want to let them drop down is we really want to get an idea of where to put our needle. So you can see my 2 beads right there. So basically, I want to take my needle and I want to come under my frame right there where the edge of that Delica laid. And I'm going to pass between the beads on the inside edge and the frame. I want my needle to rub the inside edge of that frame every time. I don't want to drag my thread across the top of my previous row. I want to go in between the beads. So now I'm going to come up through the second bead I added, which for me is on the left. And I'm going to pull that bead to where it stands up straight. I like to adjust my beads at the beginning and to go ahead and stationize that first bead. So I'm going to come down through the first bead on the right from top to bottom. And then I'm just going to go right back up my bead on the left from bottom to top. And when I pull, that basically positions those 2 beads. It straightens up the first bead, and everybody's standing up nice and straight and tall like the good little soldiers that they are. And then I'm just going to carry on just exactly like we did for the inside row by picking up 1 bead at a time. Now this time I really don't have to let that bead drop down every time, and it really saves a lot of time on this next row. I'm just going to take my needle and pass through the next 2 beads on the inside of my frame. I'm going to bring my thread around here to the front and come up through that bead that I'm adding from bottom to top. And as I pull it into position, it will stand up straight and tall. And we're just going to do that all the way around the beadwork. The only difference this time around is every now and then you may have to find a place where you need to put an extra bead in. But for right now, it's going to probably work out that you could just stick it through the next 2 beads, pull the bead into position, and pass back up through. If it turns out you have a gap, you may have to take your bead off and reposition it, but for the most part, you shouldn't run into that trouble. Just remember, when you're pulling your thread through, you want to make sure you hold your bead against the frame, just like that. And try zooming in and showing you a few. I'm picking up my bead. I'm coming out of this bead here. I'm going to go down between the next 2 beads below it. Right there. I want to feel that needle touch the frame so I know that my thread is in the right position. I'm going to come back up through that bead I'm adding from the bottom to the top and stand it up beside the previous bead. Once more, I'm going to pick up my bead. I'm going to come under the frame. Folks, a lot of times when you're doing brick stitch, you're going to have to use your own judgment. And for beginners, it can get a little tricky and you can get a little frustrated. couple of tips I want to give you. If it winds up that you have to take a bead off, take the needle off of the thread first. Then take the bead off and rethread your needle. It will save you a lot of aggravation, especially when you're working with these nylon threads. They knot fairly easily, and you don't want to wind up having to cut your thread off in the middle of your work and potentially having to start all over. I'll show you a few more. I'm picking up my bead. I'm coming under the frame between two of the green seed beads right there. I'm going to pull, position my bead on the top of my frame, take my needle and come up through the bead from the bottom to the top and pull. And speaking of knots, my two threads here, the end at the top and the working thread, are getting a little bit tangled. So what I do is I just shorten that up just a little bit, just like that. And potentially you can re-wax your thread. If you start seeing any fraying here close to the end you're working on, you will want to add some thread conditioner or a little bit more wax. Once again, the same things we want to look for. We don't want any huge gaps between our Delicas. We want to make sure that when we turn our work on its side like this, that we don't have beads that are so tight they're poking to the left or to the right or all bunched up. We want a nice, even, flat look to our beadwork. So I'm just going to keep working. And once again, we want to have an even number of beads around this outside edge. So I already have here 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8. I'm going to go ahead and count out even numbers of small piles of beads over here to the side, so that when I get close to the end, I know I'm going to wind up with an even number of beads on the outside edge of this frame. So here we are, and I've worked my way around, and I have 44 beads added of my Delica beads on the outside edge of this frame. Now if you'll notice here, I have a little small gap. There is no way I'm getting 2 beads into there. And if I put 1 bead, then I'm going to have, an odd number of beads. So that's not what we want. We got to have an even number of beads. So I'm just going to take my fingers and I'm going to gently maneuver the beads on the outside edge of this frame evenly, so where those 2 beads come close together, just like that. So now I'm going to close up this row just like I did on the inside row. I'm coming out of the bead on the right, which is my last bead. I'm going to come down from top to bottom through the very first bead, and I'm going to pull that gently but snug. And I'm going to hold on to it with my finger like that because I want it tight. Then I'm going to take my needle and I'm going to come back up through the last bead from bottom to top, and I'm going to pull that through. And now I have a thread bridge between my first and last bead on the top and the bottom, and my beadwork is closed. And I'm going to just lay this down, and I'm going to take my fingers and I'm going to gently press, just like this. And then check to make sure that when I turn my frame on the side, I don't have any beads poking out over the edge of the frame. And everything looks really good and professional. And so we're ready to move on. So for the next step, we'll be using 8/0 beads. So I'm going to get the Delicas out of the way and dump out 16 of my 8/0 beads. So the next thing we're going to do is we're going to add the 16 8/0 beads that make up this row here. And once again, we're starting a new row, so first thing we do is pick up 2. We're going to let those fall down, and we're going to see where that second bead falls on our beadwork. So we're going to skip over 2 beads on our Delicas, and we're going to take our needle and pass it under that thread bridge right there between the second and third Delica, away from the one we're exiting. We're going to pull that through. We're going to take our needle and we're going to come back up through the last bead we picked up, which for me is on the left. Then we're going to come right down through that first bead again and straighten it. And finish the job by coming back up through the bead on the left. And so we straightened up our first bead. Later on, we will put a string up through this first bead and straighten it even further and pull it closer to the bead frame or to the beadwork. But for right now, we're going to go ahead and finish adding our next beads. Now, because these beads are bigger, you may want to go ahead and let them drop down each time. to determine where you want to pass your needle under. So I'm just going to go through the next set of, the next thread bridge on the next set of beads right there. And I'm going to pull. And I'm going to pass back up through the bead I'm adding. And stand it beside the previous bead. Now at this point, I'm going to add a little extra wax to my thread because my thread is getting really airy feeling. And so that's one thing that lets me know it's time to put a little wax on. So we're almost finished with this portion of the project. I'm just going to keep on picking up a seed bead. And I've done this so many times that I can judge where to put, which thread bridge to go under, in order to situate that bead right beside the previous one. And I'm going to keep working like that. I'll let this one drop just to give you guys an idea of how to judge. So you can see where that bead is going to land right here. So you know you want to go under that thread bridge, just to the left side of it or the right side of it, and come back up. So I'm going to keep working till I get all 16 of these beads added. Now, sometimes when you're working like this, you may figure out that you might need to go through the same thread bridge twice. Generally, that won't happen when you're adding larger beads on top of a row of smaller beads. But it happens a lot when you're doing a second row of beads the same size. This thread is almost identical color to these beads that I'm adding right now. If you find that you place a bead and it has a huge gap, go ahead and take your needle off, remove the bead, thread the needle again, and move over to the next thread bridge or move back one. And make sure that you don't get your thread hung up on any of your other beadwork, because it'd be a shame to create a knot at this point or to have a mess and you have to start over. So I'll finish adding these beads by picking up one, passing under the thread bridge on the previous row. And for those of you who aren't sure what a thread bridge is, if you'll look here on this row of Delicas, the space between every two beads has a thread passing right there between the two beads. That's what's considered a thread bridge. So now we've gotten our 16 8 seed beads added on. And we've got some thread left, so we might as well go ahead and do the very next row of beads. And after that, that'll be a good place to stop for this section of the earring project. So we're coming out of this bead here. The first thing we want to do is we want to pick up a 15-0, a Delica, and a 15-0. We're going to pass down through the very next bead, 8 seed bead. We're going to add this little section of accent beads right here. Now, I want to be coming out of the top of this bead to start adding my Delicas. So in order to do that, I'm going to have to stitch around. So I'm coming out of the bottom of that 8 I'm going to take my needle and I'm going to pass through the Delica underneath it. Just like that. And I'm going to pull the thread all the way through. And then I am going to come up the Delica right beside of it. Just like this. It doesn't matter left or right. I'm just going to go up the one on the right. Then I'm going to come right back out of the top of my second seed bead, 8 seed bead over. Just like that. But make sure that you don't get into the 15-0. I just want you to come through the 8. So now we can start adding our Delicas. And we're going to add 7 Delicas. But because this is our first stitch of our brick stitch, we're going to need to pick up 2, just like we always do. I'm going to flip my work over. So I'm coming out of the top of that 8 seed bead. I picked up 2 Delicas, and I'm going to come under this very first thread bridge right here. just the thread. I'm going to come back up through this last bead I picked up, which for me will be on the left. Pull my thread all the way through. And then I'm going to go ahead and straighten up this first bead right beside of it. So I'll come down through that bead, that Delica. And then I'm going to go right back up through the last bead again, which is the one on the left for me. It'll be on the right if you're right-handed. And so when I pull, what's going to happen is those two beads are going to straighten up. They'll be stitched together, and they should be standing side by side, just like that. So now we got to add 5 more Delicas. So I'm going to pick up a Delica. I'm going to come under my next thread bridge right there. And then I'm going to pass back up through my Delica, just like we do in brick stitch. Stand that bead up. And then I'm going to pick up another Delica. And I'm going to come under that same thread bridge. Over to the left. And I'll come back up through that Delica. So now we have 4 of our Delicas added. We need to add 3 more. Pick up a Delica, come through your next thread bridge. Pass back up through the bead you're adding. Pick up your next Delica. And come under that same thread bridge. And we'll go up through the Delica. So there's 6 of our Delicas added. We need to do 1 more. We're going to pick up our Delica, and we're going to come under the next thread bridge. And come back up through our bead. You can check your work by flipping it over to, to where you're staring down at the ring like this. And make sure that everything is staying nicely aligned. So now we need to add 6 of our 8-0 beads. So I'm going to pick up an 8-0. And I'm going to go ahead and come under that same thread bridge right there. Pass up through my 8-0. And I'm going to pick up an 8-0, come under my next thread bridge. Pick up an 8-0, come under the next thread bridge. And this thread bridge is a little bit big. I might use it twice. Now, I'm not going to be able to use it twice, so I'll pick up one and just go under the next one. And this is what I meant by saying you'll have to use your own judgment. You'll have to look at your beadwork. And you'll have to see, use your judgment to see if you're going to have big gaps. So I've got 2 more to do. I'm going to pick it up, come under my next thread bridge. Come back up through my bead. And I have 1 more to add. So I'm going to pick up a nice 8-0. And this time I'm going to come under that same thread bridge. And then I'm going to come up through the last bead I'm adding. So now I have my 6 8-0s added on this row. And now I need to add 7 Delicas on this side. So I'm going to pick up a Delica. We're continuing on with this brick stitch row, so we'll only need to pick up 1 at a time. So I'm going to go into the same thread bridge that I just used. And I'm going to come back up through that Delica. This time I'm going to pick up and I'm going to skip over to my next thread bridge. And pass back up to complete my stitch. And I'm going to repeat this till I get all 7 on. I'm going to pick up a Delica. And I'm going to use that same thread bridge, because there's a pretty big gap over to the next one. So I'm going to use the same one. Bring my bead down. Pass back up through my bead. Now I can pick up and go into my next thread bridge right there. So now I have 4 Delicas on. We're getting there. I'm going to pick up a Delica, and I'm going to go under that same thread bridge. And I got 2 more to do. I'm going to pick up a Delica, go under my next thread bridge, come up through my bead, and I'm going to add my last Delica under the same thread bridge. So now I'm coming out of that the top of my 7th Delica. I'm going to take a little moment to flatten my beads out. Make sure everything looks nice and professional. I'm coming out of this Delica, but I need to be coming out of this 8/0 seed bead. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to go backwards 1 Delica, come down, pull my thread. Then I'm going to come down this 8/0 to the left, which is the 3rd from the end. And I'm going to pull. So now I can pass right up through the 2nd one from the end, just like that. And I can add my accent beads on this side. So in order to do that, we're going to pick up the 15/0, Delica, 15/0. We're coming out of the top of the 2nd to the last bead. We're going to go down the 1st bead. Then we're going to take our thread and we're going to come down the Delica to the left or right if you're sewing right-handed. And this is going to give us a little extra pull to position that bead flat against the beadwork like that. Now, I'm going to stop right here for this portion of the video because it's getting pretty long. So when we come back for the next part of the video, we are going to be adding this row of beads and accent beads. And we are going to add our Tilas. And then we will be working on putting our bezeled crystal in the middle, finishing up this last row of brick stitch in the center, and adding our bail at the top. Alright guys, so thanks for watching. Remember, if you're just jumping in, part 1 of the video of this series shows you how to create the beaded bezel for the 8mm Chaton. This is part 2. We've gotten this far with our brick stitch beadwork on our bead frame. Part 3 is going to be adding the final embellishments, putting our crystal in, and then finishing off the center and the bail. Alright guys, thanks for watching. Don't forget to subscribe to my channel, and I'll see you next time.